and joins us now live, and they forgot your name. Hello and welcome. So how was the discussions in Germany and Berlin? And more importantly, what is your take on the disillusionment, if it were, or as it were, of a youth when it comes to Nelson Mandela's legacy?
Right, so the discussion that I was part of was part of the 100-year celebration here. And of course, we know that many people have been reflecting on the Nelson Mandela legacy as a way to kind of encourage others to do well and to be good. And I think what was important about it is that there's been bubbling up of young people who are saying, we don't necessarily reject Nelson Mandela, but we're saying that there's more to this legacy than just talking about reconciliation and peace and love. Nelson Mandela is a complex man. He has a long-standing legacy that includes fighting and imprisonment and militants, but also includes being a president, and a president who made decisions, whether it was pre his time as president of the country, as president of the ANC, during those CODESA negotiations, during his time as presidency on the RDP, GEAR, the TRC. All of those decisions are part of that legacy, and those decisions affect young people today as much as the legacy of reconciliation.
Right. I mean, amongst the things that Nelson Mandela is known for is peace, which is probably why he has such a resonance internationally. But the youth feel deprived. They feel that there's bigger issues that also could be discussed, not necessarily putting the blame squarely on Nelson Mandela's feet, but also part of the discussion is equality. You know, that South Africa remains very much an unequal society. What are the young people telling you directly?
I think the disillusionment with Nelson Mandela is also a disillusionment with the liberation narrative, because Nelson Mandela is not an individual. He always said he's part of the struggle, that liberation movement. And so I think there's two things. The one is a question about an incomplete history. We have a history of the victorious moments of those times, of the positive things that came out of it, of the Rainbow Nation. But we don't know what the decisions were made that were made. We don't know what it was like to be in a government of national unity with the apartheid ministers, and what kind of conflicts that brought, what kind of decisions were made. And I think young people are starting to feel like we were sold this Rainbow Nation dream, but it was an incomplete dream. It was an incomplete narrative that didn't tell us about what the compromises were, that didn't tell us about the trade-offs, that didn't tell us why today, when you look at the structure of the economy, that inequality has risen in South Africa and white people still are at the top of the economic structure. I think maybe one of the most important ones is the question about race. If the fees must fall and roads must fall movements taught us one thing, is that race is still at the center of our country. The decolonization movement isn't just about who we're teaching in our schools. It's about the fact that we know that every day we're still living in a racially structured society. And while the TRC was great for those who got to participate in it, the rest of society hasn't been challenged to face racism that's the legacy of apartheid head on, and the racism that young people who were never part of apartheid still experience right now today. And then they get told, be more like Nelson Mandela, as opposed to get given answers and given an opportunity to express that.
Now, you're a young person in South Africa, obviously feeling the frustration from your fellow youth. The panelists at the convention were from the generation of the Nelson Mandelas. They stood by him when he was released and when he became statesman. What were they saying? What were their thoughts around some of these frustrations from the youth, particularly?
I'll definitely give credit to Trevor Manuel, Cheryl Carolus, and Joel Nishatenze for being very responsive to the critiques. I went there very hesitant. Speaking about things that are more critical, but they were responsive to it and said that, number one, they realized that there are these vacuums in history and that they may need to be filled in, and that the ANC particularly does owe it to take the nation into its confidence about those crucial moments and about the things that happened, so that people don't feel like they're just being told what they should know. But people have the ability to actually say, it's not only the good things about this movement that we should know, we need to know the bad things too. I think what I particularly appreciated was the idea that they recognize that today the struggles are persistent And while they're different in many ways in terms of their harshness and the law and all of those things, they recognize that young people's struggles reflect some of those residues of apartheid. So I was heartened by the fact that they were willing to have the conversation, and I challenged them and their contemporaries to really be bold enough to have this conversation with young people rather than to shut it down. The one thing I said to them is that the legacy of Nelson Mandela should never be used to silence the voices of young people who are struggling today. It should be used to amplify it.
Fantastic. Now, this conversation happened in Berlin, all good and well, but we need something like that to happen in South Africa. I mean, what you see in conversation is after a massive flare-up. I mean, you mentioned two fees must fall and the roads must fall incidences or movements, if I can call it that, and also, you know, some very young girls in Pretoria who were fighting for basic rights like hair representation and race and being, you know, seen to be who they are and what they are. These conversations should definitely also take place in South Africa, where the problems seemingly are stemming from. Now, what is a youth lab in particular going to do about this vacuum that you mentioned?
So Youth Lab as an organization has always prided itself in being the bridge between young people and policy and decision makers in terms of getting young people's voices heard. And so for us, it's two things, especially in light of the 2019 elections. We've already engaged young people across the country in a project called the South African Youth Manifesto to get their voices heard and to take it to political parties and politicians. But as we go into the 2019 elections, we also want to challenge particularly the older political parties to not just go to the big rallies and only, you know, go and be represented where the numbers are big, but have the bravery to come into a room of 30 to 50 young people and really answer real questions, to really take seriously the concerns and the experiences of young people. And so we'll be challenging more and more political organizations to do that, to do the work of really sitting, listening, reflecting, but taking seriously that young people are not just about the future. Young people are living the experience of South Africa today, an experience that many people who lived in the struggle don't know.
Absolutely.
And they don't know what it means to be black and poor in South Africa today. And I think the richness of the knowledge that young people have who are experiencing that today needs to be considered as valuable and needs to be considered as a tool for governance and also as a way to get those young people to lead this country and not only be beneficiaries.
Now, I know I've been told we're running out of time, but one last question from me. We need a lot of people like you, young, energized, who will drive this conversation, this movement. But I understand you're leaving Youth Lab, so where are your next steps? Where are you going? Where does the future hold for you? And also, more importantly, will you still be driving this conversation?
So I consider myself a youth worker more than a young person because I've lived my youth. I'm exiting my youth. The reason why I'm exiting Youth Lab is because I believe that young people must also create space for young people. And if I stay leading Youth Lab, which is a youth-led organization, I close the space for 21-year-olds, 26-year-olds who have the energy that you're talking about. And so for me, it's about empowering young people, even as I go forward as a youth worker, to be able to continue to drive that and creating those spaces. I have opportunities and going to Berlin, being on the National Planning Commission, many things that I can use to create space for young people and validate them, and I intend to continue to do that kind of work.
Fantastic. Tessa, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.